NEA Student e-conference from the Field Studies Council, FSC. So this is the first in a series of 3 videos, all to help you build the skills and confidence to help you tackle your independent investigation. We've had a lot of fun putting together these videos, and we really hope that they're useful to you in your studies. So this first video is all about landscape interpretation. So it's really about helping you guys as students go out into the field and really unpick the landscape, what's going on, to help you develop titles, investigation titles for your independent investigation. So in a moment, I'm going to be playing the video. The video will last about kind of 40 minutes or so. And then what will happen after that video, you'll get a chance to, have your questions answered by myself and Joe, who is our presenter within the video. So what we'll have is about 10-15 minutes or so of Q&A. Now, to submit a question that we may answer, or try to answer during the last part of the hour this afternoon, you can submit your questions to questions@fieldstudiescouncil.org, all with hyphens between field studies and council. So if you do have any questions for us that we will try and tackle at the end, it is at that questions@fieldstudiescouncil.org with hyphens in between. So yeah, we'll get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come off the microphone, come off the video, and I'm going to play that video for you.
Hello, my name's Jo. Welcome to this FSC and GA e-conference and this student video. Our aim today is to build the skills and independence for A-level geographers to help you to tackle the independent investigation. We're here at Flatford Mill and we'll be in the surrounding areas to cover some of the tasks. In the next 45 minutes, we hope to cover the following objectives. We want to build your confidence in the approaches that will help you to develop an NEA title. We're also going to explore tasks designed to interpret landscapes and unpick concepts relevant to them. And we want to share techniques with you that will help you to use secondary resources and other data to further explore an area of interest. Developing a title for your independent investigation can be a daunting prospect. Knowing where to start or what makes a good title is often a challenge for us as students. So if we think about what good questions are, they are fit for assessment. You need to remember that you have to satisfy the criteria to access all of the marks available. They're also original. The question should showcase your imaginative abilities so that you can be independent from others. Ideally, it would be focused on an area of your own interest. They also need to be relevant, so arising from issues or topics seen in literature and from real-life experience. They should be manageable. Ideally, you have to be able to access your answer to your question through sources of data, either people or documents, primary and secondary data. You need to be able to collect all of the information in order to answer your question. They've also got to be interesting. So you need to make your question interesting, but try and avoid having it being too convenient or flashy. You don't want it to sound like a newspaper headline. Remember, you're going to be thinking about this question for quite a long time, so it needs to be something you're interested in. Lastly, it needs to be clear and simple. A clear and simple research question will become more complex as you progress your own research. So you start with an uncluttered and fairly simple question that you slowly unpeel the layers away from to delve deeper into it through your reading and your writing. Now we're going to showcase 3 main ideas to help you to interpret a landscape. This will help you to delve deeper and think about the breadth and depth of topics that you can study within this location. The first thing we're going to cover is making and recording observations. And to do that, we're going to look at this bingo card. So I've chosen the concepts to go on this bingo card, covering deeper, wider and synoptic geographical links. You can see things here such as resilience, mitigation, sustainability, thresholds, interdependence. We're going to start to rigorously look at the landscape and see if these concepts apply. So our task now is to explore this location and really look for some examples of some of the terms. Now I'm going to start by looking at the term representation. So I'll try and find an example of representation in this landscape and then add some detail. So representation of this area, why does it matter here? Representation matters here because it's a really popular tourist destination. Apart from just being any other river with a nice flat walk by it, this is part of Constable country. This walk is sold as following in the footsteps of a famous English artist, John Constable. So you get lots and lots of people coming here to do just that, to experience the environment, to do the walks, to see the paintings. It gives people a reason to visit this historical place, and it gives a significance, a cultural significance to the area. This representation is created by the National Trust and the AONB and the local community as well. You can see it through the signage, through the artwork, through the museums. The strength of this connection is really positive. So it has a strong connection and it drives the economic value of this place. Now we could start to think about this linking to some of those other terms. So if we think about the link between this representation and say interdependence, we can start to think about bringing concepts together. So the AONB and the National Trust work really hard on the upkeep of this area, the conservation, the protection, making sure that it looks nice, that the signage is appropriate. And that's partly funded by some of the money that the tourism brings in. And the tourism is dependent on the place looking nice and being well signed and having good car parks and having a reason for people to come here. So there's a real link there. One thing is dependent on the other and vice versa. Now lastly, we could start to think about maybe one of these other words. So maybe we choose identity. So we've thought about the representation of this area. We're now going to consider what identity that gives it. So this location has a really strong identity of cultural and historical significance, and as well the link with the art world. But so do the surrounding villages, so do the houses, that chocolate box feel, that real connection with a rural ideal is really important here, and it spans across the people, the places and the location. So to start to investigate that further, we need to think about how those things link together in depth, and we need to start asking more serious and critical questions about the landscape. We might want to think about asking about the perceptions of this place. How do people perceive it? Do they see it in the same way that it's being formally or informally represented? We might want to start thinking about how many visitors there are, what those visitors are doing, why are they attracted to this area? We could consider where the money's coming from and where it's being spent, and who gets to decide. Who are the stakeholders and how does that affect the identity of the area? Another way of making recording observations is to use a photo or a field sketch. Now these are often underutilised in landscape assessment, but a really good annotated photo or field sketch can allow you to spend time in the environment and start to really question and to interrogate what's going on. So if we were to look out across this environment here, we can start thinking about what might be in a field sketch. Now we'd want to make sure that we get everything into our field sketch, or indeed our annotated photo. So we'd start by thinking about the landscape itself, the shape, and then start to put in parts of the landscape that are going to give us a way in which to interrogate what's going on in this landscape. So if we think about this field sketch here, what we've done here is we've started to look at the links and the interactions between human and physical environments, and between the human and physical influences on the landscape. So if you look at the actual field sketch, you can see the level of detail that's been put into the drawing, but also, and more importantly, the level of detail that's been put into the annotations. You'll notice in our field sketch, but also hopefully you'll be able to see in the distance, there is a tower right on the edge of the horizon. This is part of the Mistley Towers, which are old maltings factories that are in a small kind of old post-industrial village on the horizon here of this Essex landscape. Now we can start to look at that in more detail and start to ask more in-depth questions about it. So we can think about it in terms of the physical influence on the landscape, so the actual break in the horizon, having the kind of urban and industrial mark on this landscape. We can think about possible air pollution, noise pollution. We can think about how it may have affected the skyline, how it may have affected the environment. We can think about excess traffic or noise with people getting to that area, transporting away from that area the goods. We can think about why it was built there in the first place, so the fact that it's on the mouth of the River Stour, giving it access so that transportation of goods is readily available. But then we can start to think about the human influences. We can think about the jobs it would have created, and the fact that most of the maltings are now shut, and therefore those jobs are maybe in decline, and how that might affect population change in the area, how it might affect the inequality in the area. We can think about people's quality of life around those maltings factories. Would it be something that you are proud of? I know that people who go to the village, or people that live in the village, often comment on the smell, the biscuity smell from the maltings factory, as being a link to the past and a part of that rich cultural history. We could also think about the fact that maybe now that that's not a thing, is it a past reminder of more industrial times, or is it something that reminds people that there used to be jobs there and there isn't anymore? So we can start to also then link those things together. Maybe we could start to think about how the maltings factories look, and therefore how people feel, and link those influences together to think about this landscape more in depth. In the same way, we could look at a more physical aspect of the landscape and look at the actual area of land by the river. Now the river you might not be able to see at the moment because it's behind the trees, but it snakes through this land, creating vast floodplains on either side of it. And you might just be able to see that those floodplains are currently being used as pastoral farming. So there are some sheep just in the middle ground here in the field. So again, we can start to ask questions. Why is there mostly pastoral farming when we might think that quite fertile floodplain land might be useful for crops? Well, actually, as it floods quite regularly, crops aren't going to do particularly well, whereas the sheep can be moved so that they're in areas that are not flooded, or areas that are richer in grass at any one time. These fields are actually a patchwork of fields, all kind of sectioned by hedgerows, and we can think about the effect of those hedgerows on the environment, and whether actually farmers are being kind of encouraged to use hedgerows. So replanting hedgerows has been part of agri-environmental schemes for quite a while now, in order to be able to increase the diversity in the area. We can also think about what that says about this environment. It's quite a rural environment, and what that means maybe for people who live here. But you also might be able to see further in the distance this way, there is a fairly large settlement up on the hill, which is called Manningtree. So there are urban settlements as well as pastoral and rural in Manningtree there is a train line directly into London, which takes about an hour and 10 minutes to get there. So then you can start to think about the influences of a big city and how that might impact second homes, house pricing, where people work, commuters, all those kinds of things. Now the field sketch really allows us to critically evaluate this landscape by bringing all of those things together and allowing us to make judgments and assess what we can see in a qualitative way. That can give rise to things that interest you, and then you can start thinking about how you might find out the answers to those questions. Another way of doing this is to start to create geographical lenses or frames. By applying different geographical lenses to a location, we can start to think about things that might be at first hidden or masked from us. We can then start to broaden out our perceptions of that environment so that we can take away any personal bias and start to bring in synoptic links into different and wider geographical concepts. So we can do this by using frames with our concepts on to take a photo of the location, and that's going to help us to exemplify this concept within the location. We can then start to break down and really understand how prosperity in this case is exemplified in Dedham. So in Dedham High Street here, we can show a scene looking through the frame of prosperity. Dedham is a honeypot site. It's a tourist trap, and it's entirely designed to draw people in to spend money. For example, this place has really exclusive shops filled with non-essential items. All of the shops and the buildings fit within the rural ideal. We've got the Essex Tea Room, a 16th century tea house, and a co-op which is designed to look like an old-fashioned high-class grocer's. All of this fits in with the idea that coming to Dedham is designed to make you feel comfortable. It's a traditional place, and everything here is designed to take your money. Next, we can start to consider the frame of diversity. Now, looking through this lens, we can start to think about who is here and what kind of cultural backgrounds, age groups, genders, and general diversity of the population that is visiting. Now, in normal times, this place would be filled on a June day with lots and lots of people visiting the area. Mostly, they would be older people, maybe retired people on day trips. When we're thinking about diversity, we can also start to think about the people that live here, and you might want to consider how you would find out those things, whether you would look at something like a non-participant observation of who's here, or looking at census data. Lastly, let's look at the lens of accessibility. Thinking about who is welcome or not welcome in this place, who feels comfortable, who might be excluded. Is everyone able to use this space? We can think about whether these lenses altogether support our view of a place or contrast our own opinions. Also, by finding contrasting lenses, we can start to see where conflict or inequality may arise.
We've already looked at various ways of making and recording observations in our first main idea. Next, we will look at our second idea, which is using secondary data to further our independent investigation development. Here are some ideas of how secondary data can be used. The first thing to look at is news headlines. Looking at newspapers or articles can help us to form ideas that might spark our interest. We can look for news articles that are current and interesting about the location that you've chosen. For example, this is a blog extract from Ipswich, an area where an old industrial dock has been long in the midst of a regeneration project with many failings. Here you can see a representation of public view of the area and the issues that are arising there. This might at first be interesting because it is an emotive and quite amusing piece and gives a really detailed insight into the strength of negative feeling towards the project. However, when you look at it in more detail, It could spark an idea or an area of further research that might in future become a research question for you. Take the time to have a little read through. We could start to look at it in detail by breaking the article down through textual analysis or coding to see what the main themes are. Just a quick skim of this writing shows that it's a very negative piece, but the use of emotive and evocative language really paints a picture of how the residents feel about the dock area. The words nuclear meltdown may seem hyperbolic, but there is no ambiguity as to the strength of feeling. It would be really interesting to see if we could find alternate views to this one, and by doing more research we might see those. For example, does anyone think that the regeneration is a positive step or is being handled well? Here we can gain an insight into the stakeholders. This is invaluable for us as geographers as it allows us to start to think about other perceptions and viewpoints. Who else might be interested in this development? Where is the money coming from? What approaches have been taken, e.g. top-down or bottom-up? We would need to think about the ways in which we could gather primary data to understand the motivation and viewpoints of all of the stakeholders. Here we can collect some qualitative evidence about the situation now, what's actually happening currently. How could we investigate if this is accurate? As remember, this is just one person's view. Primary data collection techniques or other secondary sources might help us. If we're looking for photos of the area, say on Google image search, we could identify areas that exemplify this description or indeed challenge it. We can also start to think about what evidence there is and look for the reasons behind what is happening. We could categorise these reasons or factors into things such as environmental, economic and social. But are there any other categories that we could choose? What wider themes do these things link to? We could look at inequality or resilience or maybe sustainability. Thinking bigger and broader may help us to find out what we're actually interested in studying. For example, you might think that all of this information leads you to thinking about the broad topic of economic sustainability. But how would you then tighten that up into the form of a manageable research question? One way might be to start to look for other data sets that could help us by giving evidence and extra information to back up these questions or areas of interest and therefore pin down what we actually want to look at. We can look for particular data sets that can be interrogated and showcase trends that would lead us to form questions about the location. If we found them, we could start to look for more quantitative evidence to underpin those broad ideas from before. For example, if we use the index of multiple deprivation maps, then we can look at the overall deprivation levels in and around the area of the docks where the regeneration is occurring. The overall IMD score is made up of 7 domains, including health, employment, income, education, etc. And each area is scored as a percentile of its relative deprivation in England. As you can see, in this case, it would be really useful as we can start to see why Ipswich residents might be feeling so negatively towards the dock development, as it's an area of low deprivation surrounded on 3 sides by residential areas with an overall pretty high deprivation. This could get us thinking about inequality in general and feedback between areas as larger concepts. Other data sets such as crime reports may tell us about an area and how safe the people feel in that place. It could also give insights into desirability of living there or give indications of inequality, employment and income deprivation, or a lack of social activities for young people. Street Check is a great resource for looking at crime in an area. Here we can see that you can look at the number of crimes in an area, but you can also find out what type of crimes have occurred. This data is for October 2019. If we compare it with May 2020 during a global pandemic and national lockdown, do we see a difference? Probably yes. We could go on to interrogate this data and think about how the threat of crime may shape a place and how it might lead to planning and development innovations in areas of regeneration. This could lead you to focus in a question on a broader topic of crime. A third idea is to think about published articles or other data sources that you might find interesting. We can often find interesting, informative, and most importantly, well-researched and peer-reviewed information in journals, geography publications, and published articles. This provides us with a cited reference on which to base or spark an idea for a research question. Here we can see the Health of the High Street research, which is a very interesting read and can back up some of our broad themes and ideas of what to study with some research done. We might then choose to look in more depth about how this data has been collected, which may inspire some of our own thoughts on collecting information. Another source of information is the PPS, or Project for Public Space. On this website, you will gather a wealth of information, from describing placemaking to giving suggestions to what makes a successful place, to global case studies and examples of successful placemaking. This might spark interest or a question that could be relevant to a place that you're studying, or just give you ideas of what else to look for. Secondary sources of data don't just apply to human investigations or urban settings. Here we have an example of land use coverage in a river catchment, compiled from Esri data on ArcGIS. This allows us to interpret the landscape and look at the proportions of different land uses within it, which could lead us to questioning carbon storage in the catchment or the relative rates of interception or infiltration, just to name a few. Also, we can gather information about sediments. Here is a map showing offshore sediments in South Pembrokeshire. This might be interesting and illuminating if we wanted to understand coastal systems, sediment cells, or the formation of sand dunes in the area. We can also find geology maps, which will allow us to build up a picture of the landscape and the physical factors that affect it, such as whether the rock is permeable or how resistant to erosion it is. All of these things would be helpful in broadening our understanding of the landscape and pinpointing areas of interest to further study. Overall, we should definitely be making use of secondary data sources, whether from newspapers, available datasets, or published articles. These things will certainly help us to formulate strong ideas, which we can then further develop into a research question.
We're now going to consider our third idea for interpreting landscapes, which is concept mapping. As geographers, we need to be able to look across topics and ideas, looking for relationships and linkages. Concept mapping is a really useful tool for helping geographers to explore individual topics and their links within an environment. For example, in this environment, which is a woodland ecosystem, there are loads of different observations we can make. So some of the observations that have already been made are here on the board on our concept map. You can see here we've started with the fact that this is a managed woodland. Now, evidence for that is that the trees here seem to be in rows. So they're in straight lines all the way through the ecosystem. Now, that suggests to us that they have been planted for a reason. Okay? Our second observation that's already been made is that we have deciduous trees here. Now, we don't need to worry about what type or what species of tree they are, but they're all deciduous trees, which means that they're going to lose their leaves in the autumn. Okay, it also means, for the most part here, that these are broadleaf trees. Okay, so we've got some observations there to start with. And we can start to add our own observations of this area. So the first thing I'm going to say is about tree density. So I'm going to estimate that in this area, in any 10 by 10 metre area, we've got a density of about 4 trees. So tree density, 4 trees per 10 metres by 10 metre grid. Okay. Another observation that we could make is that this section of trees here, this area of woodland, is on a riverbank. So it's right next to the river. There's not much water in the river at the moment, but it is still next to the river there. And the third observation that I'm going to make is a broader observation about the kind of local area or environment here, and that's that we're in a very rural area, and that mostly the land use is pastoral farming. Now hopefully you just heard those sheep, which means that that's my evidence, okay? So even if you couldn't see the surrounding area, which is very hard to hear because we're in the trees, you can hear that the whole of the area surrounding us is the noise of tractors and sheep. Okay, so we've got pastoral farming as our surrounding land use. Now we can start to think about what those things mean. So the tree density is quite high. There's quite a lot of trees, so they're tightly packed. And they're also, because they're in full leaf, they're creating quite a high canopy coverage. Okay. The fact that it's on a riverbank means that there is going to be an influence on the discharge of the river due to intersection and maybe the effect of reduced surface runoff. Okay, and then thinking about our land use around here, we can start to think about how that might link in as well. So we might think about irrigation, okay, so to do with the water in the channel. We might also think about woodland clearance or grazing. We could continue to explore those linkages, and we could start to make links between every different thing. Everything in geography is connected, especially in an ecosystem like this. But what we also could do is we can start to begin to kind of broaden out these linkages into bigger concepts or themes. So if we think about the water cycle and how it's being managed in this area, and the river and the woodland, then we can really think of that in terms of a system, okay, which is one of our geographical concepts, kind of underpinning the learning that we might have and underpinning the knowledge that we might need to design an individual investigation. We might also think, if we're kind of looking at how the area is being managed in order to regulate that and prevent flooding maybe downstream, or make sure there's enough water for the farmland, so the irrigation and any kind of water that's necessary for that pastoral farming, we might think about the theme of mitigation. Okay, so making changes or protecting for the future in order to stop any risk of running out of water or having too much water downstream. We also might be able to think about the theme of adaptation. Okay, so again, that's kind of in with mitigation, so adapting the environment so that it works for our farming industry. And if we think about all of those things together, what we're really kind of pulling out is the idea of sustainability. Because actually managing systems by adapting the way they work to mitigate against running out or having too much water, what we're really talking about is sustainability, and we could start to then focus on sustainable management. So actually, What we would then maybe have in the middle is our overriding theme of sustainable management. And what we've done is created a map with all of our observations, our thoughts, our explanations, our evidence, bringing that together and actually focusing down onto one big concept. And you can work that either way. Start with the concept and work out, or start with your observations and work back in.
We would really encourage you to think about a topic, location, or area that you are interested in investigating, and then try some of the ideas showcased in this video. We hope that this will be helpful in really considering the breadth and depth of titles available to you. Once you've explored some options, you may find it useful to reflect on the different ideas that you have started to develop. This kind of matrix is really helpful to start building up from an idea into a testable, meaningful question. You could start with a broad idea or the concept map like we looked at before, and begin to pick out points using these starters to build up a few different questions. Try not to go too narrow just now. At the point where you have a few questions in mind, using something like this can be really helpful to start to think in detail about what can actually be achieved. If you cannot think how you collect enough data, both primary and secondary, in order to answer your question, then maybe you're going down the wrong avenue. Or if, for example, you can't think of why you might use a certain method, or you're struggling to justify a particular technique, then maybe they're not the right choices for this question. By using this kind of format, you can pin down the very best dilution of your question to the most manageable, relevant, and achievable independent investigation. There's an awful lot of useful information out there to help you interrogate a landscape and to begin developing questions. Some of our favourites at the FSC are the following. The Royal Geographical Society Student Guide is a really useful tool and well worth a read, especially the Before You Start section, which shares information on the considerations you need to make before getting on with your investigation. Another favourite of ours is Gilbert's 8 Ways of Thinking. It's a really nice way of interpreting landscapes and drilling down into what is interesting and the different perceptions that we have. The Walkability Survey is another assessment of environment and the strategies used within them, but it has some interesting information as to what to look for in a landscape. It assesses the perception of neighbourhood design features related to physical activity, including residential density, land use mix, including both indices of proximity and accessibility, street connectivity, infrastructure for walking and cycling, for example, neighbourhood aesthetics, traffic, crime safety, and neighbourhood satisfaction. So all round a really useful tool to gather lots of information. Lastly, the aroma wheel is another of our favourites, an innovative way of assessing an area and putting a new spin on data collection. You look for smellyscapes such as indicators of industrial, food, waste and synthetic smells, and this allows you to interpret the environment in a new and exciting way.
So that's about it for the landscape interpretation student video. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope it's been useful and will continue to be useful for you. Please do go and look at the review tasks that will be in the video here, and make sure that you do take them forward in your geography endeavours. Bye!
Hello and welcome back. I hope that was really useful to you all. And I'm really pleased to announce that we have got our presenter, Jo, about to join us on the Zoom as well. Hi there, Jo.
Hello.
So fantastic video. Thank you for popping that together.
No worries. It was fun to do.
Good. Now, obviously, we are not expert filmmakers. We are field tutors. So my first question to you is, how did you find putting together that video for A-level students?
It was lots of fun. It was very windy, as you might have heard. Even in Suffolk, we've got a few little hills, and I managed to stand at the top of one. So it was really good. It was interesting trying to navigate lots of members of the public. That was an interesting thing, but it was nice to actually feel like I was doing some teaching. So yeah, really enjoyed it. Hope it was helpful.
Lovely, thanks Jo. So hopefully you guys at home have been able to watch that video and really think about, well, perhaps some of those tasks might be really useful when it comes to developing your own questions for your independent investigation. So perhaps Jo introducing the concept bingo or doing that field sketch in the environment could really help you when it comes to doing your making observations about your environment. Perhaps you've been sparked your curiosity and thinking, well, I know I'm going to look for more secondary data to help me inform my own investigation title. So we have got a few questions that have come in, and I can see them written down here. They've been sent to me. But just in case you are now thinking, oh, I've got some questions to answer, just a reminder, that is the email that you can email them to us, questions@fieldstudiescouncil.org with the hyphens in. But we are going to tackle one of our first questions. So Jo and myself, Janine from FSC, will try and answer some of the questions we've had coming in. So one of the first ones Jo has to tackle is, so we've mentioned specialised concepts a lot in that video. So we've got a student wanting to know, where do I find specialised concepts within geography? Do you want to take that question, Jo?
Yep, sure. So all of the concepts that we used in the video are from the specification. So just look at your own specification relevant to your exam board, and they'll be listed in there. And they're generic, so they'll be across the board for any location or any topic. You can find relevant kind of links to any of those in most environments. But yeah, they'll be there for you in your specification, so just check.
Lovely, thanks there, Jo. We've got another question, which I think is really, really interesting. This one is all about, how do you choose where to go to take the data for your independent investigation? Now, this question is really important because there might be different ways that that is presented to you as a student. You may have a teacher that is saying, well, this is the environment that we're going to, so it's already given to you. You may have a teacher that's saying, oh, well, there's a few different environments that we're able to go to. Or you might have complete free reign of the environments that you can go to. As a fieldwork tutor, Jo, what are your top tips for helping students choose the location to collect their data in?
Yeah, just to reiterate, great question. I think it's something that is really important to consider. So my top tips would be, firstly, make sure that you are interested in the location. Don't just choose kind of ease or the place that you're in necessarily. I know at the moment that's might be more difficult, but you've got to try and think about something that you're actually interested in. You also need to make sure that the place or the location or the ecosystem that you want to look at is safe and accessible, and you have permission to be there. So safe in that you can do a risk assessment and you can take into account any hazards that might be there and kind of control those. So make sure that it's a safe place for you to be. Accessible, as in you can get there yourself, and that you can actually get to the place. So if you're wanting to look at a particular area of trees, that actually you can get into that woodland and it's not all fenced off or something. And then the other part of that is that you do have permission. So thinking about landscapes specifically rather than urban areas in rural or kind of sort of coastal or any kind of ecosystem like that, you just need to make sure that you've checked who owns that land and whether they're okay for you to be sort of wandering around measuring things. I'd also make sure that you think about how easy it is to gather the data within that ecosystem or landscape, because you need to make sure that you've got enough time to collect enough data to get reliable and representative information. So you don't want to have kind of 3 areas that are so far apart they take, like, it's going to take days for you to do it, because you want to make sure that you can collect enough data to get really good results. So yeah, that would be my top tips.
Perfect. Thanks, Jo. That's a really great answer. And that last bit that you've just mentioned there about time being spent in the field will actually help us answer another question that we've got in. So we've got a question saying, how long will it or should it take me to collect my data in the field? And I think that's such a hard question to answer. Jo's nodding and I completely agree. And it's all about making sure that you, as a researcher in the field, can really justify that you have got enough data that is both reliable and representative that can really help you answer your question. So we can't say, oh, it should take you 6 hours or 2 days or whatever. It's really about you as a researcher being able to justify that you have got enough data that makes any conclusions that you're drawing reliable or representative as well. Jo, is that something you would echo as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you're thinking about how many bits of data you need, it's often worth thinking about what you're going to do with it. So, for example, if you're thinking about using questionnaires or some kind of survey, you can't possibly do anything really useful if you've only got a couple of answers. So you're going to need to have quite a lot of data in order to be able to either do some kind of statistical analysis or just kind of, put it into a usable format and get some reliable results. So often the size of the sample depends on the type of information you're gathering, and you can think about that in terms of a statistical analysis. Not that it's you don't have to do one, but if that gives you a helping hand if you're trying to think about sample sizes.
Lovely, thanks, Jo. We've got a question just come in, so excuse me, I'm just going to read it here. So we've got a question here about, although there are obvious links, how do you choose whether to do a more human or a more physical geography fieldwork investigation? Is it just personal preference, or is there anything else to consider? What are your thoughts with that one, Jo?
So is that just a name check? That's Lucy, isn't it? Lucy sent that one in. So yeah, Lucy, I think personally it is down to your personal preference. I think the most important thing is whether you are interested in it. So if you have, lots of students do have a leaning towards kind of more physical or more human. If you do, then go with your instincts. If you don't, and you're kind of like, oh, I don't mind, it's either one or a mixture of both, which is also really interesting as well, then I would start to think about what the accessible and kind of easy places to get to are, and whether you can find something interesting. So yeah, I think there isn't a kind of winning formula that means one is easier than the other, or that you'll get more marks or anything. It's simply about whether you can find out the answers to the question that you're interested in.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, and I think I would add as well is I would think about what might you do in analysis part of that investigation as well. Perhaps, if you're very good at analysing text information, you might be interested in some coding. That might take you more down a human investigation. Perhaps if you're more focused on doing some quantitative analysis, so you've got more of those skills, again, you might focus on that part and do a more physical investigation. But for me, I think what you've said there about where your passions lie and that personal interest is a real key consideration. We've got another question, which is, and this one's from Maisie this time, how long should a research question be, and should it incorporate all of the concepts of an investigation or just be an overall summary? So that's quite a tricky question. So I think when I look at that question, my kind of feeling and how I'd answer that is your research question itself should be a good overall kind of overarching summary of what your investigation is about. And then what we should be doing is with those perhaps hypotheses or key questions that fit underneath your overarching title, so those sub-questions, that's where you bring focus to your investigation. So you might have, a nice focused research question, but then you're able to go down into that depth that you need to within your investigation using those hypotheses, sub-questions that sit underneath that. That's my thoughts on that. Jo, what about you?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I certainly wouldn't try to shoehorn all of the concepts in. you might get 1 or 2 in your kind of starting point where you start to think about what you're interested in. You might even end up with 1 or 2 kind of underpinning your research question, but you certainly don't need to try and get all of them in or multiple ones in, because A, not all of them will be relevant to your question, and B, I think it will become very confusing. So yeah, I would definitely go with, again, what you're interested in and what's relevant to that environment or ecosystem.
Yeah, and although you may not have specialized concepts within your title, they may come within your conclusions that you're drawing as well. So you don't have to just get them in that title there as well. I hope that was helpful there. And I think we've got a little final question in, which is, should our data be collected individually or as a group? Now, all the guidance on what you should be doing independently and what you can collaborate on are within your specifications. So really important that you look at those. There are certain aspects of the investigation that you must do independently. So deciding on your methods, deciding on your sampling strategy, coming up with your title, there are things that you should be working on independently. You can collect data in groups, and for some parts of a method, that's crucial. It would be very difficult to do beach profiling, for example, on your own. What's really important, though, is that you've played a part within that group, and you're able to understand and justify your role within that group. Anything to add there, Jo?
No, well, just, yeah, that making sure that you know which bits your data are almost. So if you needed a helping hand in Janine's example of beach profiling, you can't do that on your own, but making sure that you've got maybe someone to hold a ranging pole, somebody to take the recording, but those are your sets of data and those are your that's your raw data you're going to be using, and then maybe you could help them to do something different. So ideally you want to be able to have ownership of your own data. That's quite important.
Perfect. Thanks there, Jo. So looking at the time, that's us probably coming to the end of our Q&A. But it's been fantastic having our expert Jo from our Fieldwork video. So thank you for joining us, Jo.
You're more than welcome.
And we really hope this video this afternoon was really useful to you guys as A-level students. Just a reminder that this is video number 1. We've got 2 more videos happening tomorrow at 4 p.m. And also Thursday at 4 p.m. And the next 2 videos are really going to be looking at physical geoskills tomorrow and human geoskills on Thursday. So we're going to be unpicking lots of methods that you can do in human and physical geography. So we really hope that was useful. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.